Great, thank you. So Morteza is an associate professor of psychology, computer science, and brain and creativity, and the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California. He received an MS and a BS at UCLA and a PhD from Northwestern. He does research that spans the boundary between psychology and artificial intelligence, including using NLP with applications in moral decision-making, group dynamics, and intergroup conflict and negotiation. He's received multiple awards, including an NSF Career Award and a Young Investigator Award from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. With that, I'll let you take it away.
Well, thank you so much. It's always great to be back at ISI, even if it's virtually, to meet some old friends and colleagues and to sort of catch up on the research that we're all doing. I just have to give you guys a warning that I have two small kids and they have a tendency to just storm into the room and to scream, but that's completely out of my hands. So we can take those as sort of mini breaks if it does happen. I was thinking about what to talk about today, and rather than focusing on a specific study, I thought it might be a good idea to give an overview of some of the work that I've been doing in the past, I would say 4 to 5 years, on the intersection of computation and morality. So overall, I would say the theme that brings these different threads of work that I'm going to discuss today together is essentially that we're trying to bring and integrate diverse data to try to study morality in the wild and move away from the lab and artificial paradigms. I'd like to start by acknowledging the folks who have actually done the work. I'm going to just name a few whose work I'm going to discuss. Joe Hoover, Brendan Kennedy, and Ida are some of the leading authors of the work that I'm going to discuss today. The majority of our experimental work follows the following procedure. We start and we ground our work using theories in psychology and social sciences. We do observational work, mostly using language. And then we do experimental work, which typically involve classical social psychological settings and paradigms. I'm going to use this framework as the agenda of my work, of this talk as well. So first, I'll very briefly talk about morality research and psychology. I'll probably give the shortest possible intro that is to morality research. Then I'll talk about analysis of moral language. And then I'll talk about two specific domains. One is moralization in social networks and the emergence of violence during protests. And the second domain is hate, specifically hate speech and hate crimes. Lastly, if there is time, I have a few slides on current and future work that I'll discuss. So let's get started with morality research and psychology. As some of you who have been involved in one way or the other in morality work know, moral thought and behavior are notoriously difficult to capture empirically. The most common approaches include directly asking participants what their moral judgments are on various issues or vignettes. These are self-reports, and as we all know, there are some issues with self-reports. There are biases. There's this notion that people try to project an ideal version of themselves rather than responding as who they truly are. And with lab-based studies, observation in lab-based studies, they have their own problems. The domains and the scenarios that are often used are very abstract, and often the relationship to real-world behavior is not clear. Nonetheless, over the past 20 years, many theories of human morality have emerged within the social sciences, and all have their own strengths and weaknesses. The issue there is that different theories rely on different surveys and methodology, and it's difficult to adjudicate. I'm very sorry. Okay, there was some background noise on my side. Okay.
Oh, as an aside, we don't hear the background noise.
Okay. Okay. With that said, my work is built on and contributes to the moral foundations theory. This is a theory that posits that there are 5 psychological systems or intuitions that account for various aspects of our moral lives and moral intuitions. Each serve different but related social functions, and the degree of sensitivity towards these concerns can change over time. They vary across cultures and contexts, but more or less, these concerns seem to be innate and existent in various different cultures. These 5 foundations include caring and protecting individuals from harm, concerns regarding acts of cooperation, reciprocity and cheating, loyalty, patriotism, self-sacrifice, as well as their vice counterparts, such as betrayal and unfaithfulness, concerns regarding respect and insubordination, and last but not least, sanctity, disgust, degradation, and pollution. Often, the first 2 foundations are referred to as the individualizing foundation, and the last 3 as the binding foundations. And the reason for that is the first 2 are mostly focused about individual morality, whereas the last 3 are about moral concerns that bind us to our group and make the group more cohesive. Now, for us, one big question has always been whether naturally occurring linguistic behavior is related to self-reports of moral concerns. In other words, is there evidence for the moral foundations in everyday language? So we collected a data set from participants from yourmorals.org. My group is actually taking over that service and bringing it to the 21st century. These participants volunteered their Facebook updates. We had IRB approval, we had approval from Facebook as well. So what this data essentially provided us is participants' Facebook updates in addition to their completed 30-item Moral Foundations Questionnaire, or MFQ, which was designed by Jesse Graham and Jonathan Haidt and all, to basically measure people's tendencies on these 5 different moral concerns. So overall, we had around 2,700 participants, about 110,000 posts. In the first study, what we did was that we were interested in investigating whether there is a relationship between language and moral concerns. That is, if we can take a participant's language, produced language, Facebook updates, and predict their responses on the Moral Foundations questionnaire. In other words, we wanted to go from observed online behavior to psychological and demographic attributes. But then we decided, in order to get greater interpretability with respect to an application to moral psychology, to reverse the direction of our model. That is, to investigate which facets of our language are related to moral concerns. In other words, if we know someone's moral concerns, can we predict the categories of words that they're more likely to produce? Okay. If you look at previous approaches that have tried to tie linguistic behavior to psychological questionnaires, you see that overall a subject's language is uniformly aggregated across posts. Usually coarse measures of rate of certain language is used. Our goal here was to try to be more context sensitive. And I'll come back to this notion of bringing context to analysis of moral language over and over again. We had this intuition that it's not always across all different instances that people are going to express these moral concerns. They're going to express it in particular contexts, and we should be able to catch those contexts and be able to weight them more and relate them to to our dependent variables, which are responses to moral foundation questionnaire. So therefore, we used multi-instance learning with attention, and we also used more linguistically informed text representations. So I basically I talked about MIL here. There's no reason to cover this again. I'm just going to jump into the results. The numbers that you see here are percent variance explained, or R squared, across representations per foundation. So can you guys see my arrow? Can someone tell me?
Yes.
Yes, no? Okay. So the measures on top, the numbers on top are from measures of moral language from Moral Foundations Dictionary or Moral Foundations Dictionary 2.0. These are essentially similar DDR's distributed dictionary representations. So rather than doing the word count, we're basically doing similarity between embedding representations of the words and the text that we're interested in. And these are general measures of language. So the first thing that we see is that, yes, across the foundations, we can explain significant portion of variance for each of the moral foundations. We can do, of course, a lot better for purity than we can do for care. And generally, there seems to be a tendency that these binding foundations tend to have more unique and stronger signatures than the individualizing foundations. And of course, we get the best results with birth representations. So what this tells us is that, yes, there is a relationship between language and moral concerns. We can take someone's Facebook updates and predict their moral concerns with decent accuracy. Then, as I said, in the second study, we reverse our DVs and our IVs. That is, we try to predict rates of production of essentially dictionary words from Luke, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, using people's responses to Moral Foundations questionnaires as DV. The gray cells are not significant after Bonferroni correction. The coefficients here mean that essentially rate of change. So if we have a 1 unit increase in purity, in endorsement of purity in our dependent variable, I'm sorry, if we have a 1 unit increase in, for example, purity, we would have a 0.32 increase in the rate that people use religion-related words. Again, a unit increase in endorsement of Purity Foundation is basically related to 0.19 negative or decrease in the use of sexual words. So this basically, was there a question?
I have a question actually. In this work and the previous experiments, did you use any other features about people, their personality, demographics, political
That's
affiliation?
an excellent question. That's an excellent question. So yes, in both, the results that you see here are, they don't take into account people's demographic information, but I cropped a table, and at the end, I'd be happy to show it to you. I just thought it would be too much. The same table, if we control for people's demographics, and there is still, we can explain a lot of the variance, even if we take into account people's demographic information.
All right, thank you, thanks.
Thank you, Christina. All right, moving along. So the first study basically establishes that there are unique linguistic signatures or signals for these moral foundations in language, and we can use NLP to try to recover them and to map them back to responses to the moral foundations questionnaire. Then the issue becomes, we are not going to have access to ground truth all the time. That is, we're not going to know people's responses to moral foundations questionnaire. So can we do this without having access to essentially these ground truth? That is, can we take a piece of text and determine what type of moral framing that particular piece of text is trying to emphasize? We've done a lot of work in this domain, and if I want to summarize our whole approach, I would say we're basically taking baby steps in order to try to establish context in the analysis of moral language. Morality is about context. Moral dilemmas happen within context. So it's very important to know the context in which a particular piece of language is being uttered. It's very important to know who the speaker is. It's very important to know who the listener is and how these various different factors interplay to sort of get the meaning that is intended for that moral utterance. In this work, and this was a collaboration with Hang Ji, what we tried to do was try to establish context by incorporating background knowledge. So if you have this particular tweet, oh, right, Connecticut has marriage equality, so that's why Hurricane Sandy is affecting us. Thanks for that reminder, Westboro Baptist asshats. If you don't know what Westboro Baptist refers to, Westboro Baptist Church, you're going to miss the sentiment of this tweet. So in this work, essentially what we do is that we do name entity recognition, and we go to Wikipedia, we get the abstract, and we incorporate it in the representations of the text. So here we had 5,000 tweets about Baltimore protests from 2016, I believe, annotated by 3 RAs. And we can see that if we include background knowledge to our embeddings, we do a lot better compared to the other methods. And frankly, labels predicted by this model were generally not distinguishable from labels generated by humans. So if we add a fourth annotator, and essentially the overlap between the fourth annotator and the first 3 is indistinguishable from the overlap between the labels generated by this model and the first 3 annotators. In this other line of work, we look at demographic embeddings. We all know that the experience of language is individual. Evaluation of meaning, assessment of intent, cognitive and affective processing of language are unique to each person. What something means to me is going to mean different to another person. And of course, the variation is greater when social context, specifically moral concerns, are involved. So our goal here was to construct listener-specific computational representations of text. And again, these are baby steps. What we tried to do here was try to augment normative representations with demographic embeddings. Our goal was that if we have a demographic space, such as this, where we have political ideology and age, just for an example, we would want to learn a transformation of this demographic space into morality space. So if in the demographic space, the longest distance is between a conservative, younger guy and an older liberal guy, arguably in the morality space, these relationships will be different. That is, the similarity between the biggest difference in the morality space is going to be between the younger conservative guy and the younger liberal gal. So we wanted essentially to be able to learn these transformations. Very easy what we did. So we trained our representations on data from yourmorals.org, about 130,000 responses, for which we had moral foundation responses to moral foundations questionnaire, and we had demographic data. So simple feed-forward neural network where we're predicting moral foundation responses to moral foundations questionnaire from this demographic information. And once the transformation is learned, we basically take the embedding layer and simply concatenate it to the normative representations of text that we got from, I believe, fast text. Now, how do we evaluate it? We got 950 respondents from mTurk. Essentially, people got vignettes such as this. You see a professor giving a bad grade to a student just because he dislikes them, or you see a boy setting a series of traps to kill stray cats in the neighborhood. We collected political ideology, age, gender, and religiosity. And for each of these vignettes, participants were asked to basically tell us their emotional response and the evaluation of moral wrongness. I'm not going to go over the details. I'm just going to talk about the missing data task. And here, the results that you see are from representations that have the demographics as one-hot encodings, and where we have the text representations concatenated with the demographic representations. And those are the blue lines. These are average R-squareds over all leave one out tests. And as we see, demographic embeddings do significantly better in predicting people's responses to moral wrongness and to emotional responses compared to demographics, the embeddings that only include demographic information as one-hot encodings. We don't see a difference in the non-moral domain, which is expected. The transformations are only learned through for taking demographics into the moral space. We also don't see a difference in care, and we don't know why. We've also looked at modeling the effects of speaker context. So in the previous work, we were looking at listener context, how my demographics as a listener are going to affect the way I interpret a particular moral vignette. Here, we're looking at the importance of speaker, how the demographics of a speaker can affect the interpretation of moral language. And I also like to note that last year we released a corpus of 35,000 tweets, each one hand annotated by at least 3 RAs. I know some people at ISI are already using this corpus. This is publicly available, and I'd be happy if I see more people use it. I mean, this is a hard problem, and we tackle the problem together. Okay, now let's talk about the sort of more applied, more psychological work. So now that we know that moral concerns have unique signatures in language, and that we can train models to pick up these signatures from text, how can we use this? How can we use these models to basically study and investigate domains that are morally related, and we don't want to necessarily rely just on questionnaires or psychological experiments. We want to investigate this in the wild. And I have to just say that this work was done a couple of years ago, before all the recent events. I was trying to think how I would interpret these findings in light of the recent BLM movement. And maybe we can leave that aside for now and just talk about this work. Or maybe I'll say something of how I'm trying to reconcile the findings with what's happening in the world right now. So the overall goal of this project was to basically see whether we can understand and predict the emergence of violent behavior at protests. We propose violent protests can be in part understood as a function of two key risk factors. One, the degree to which people see the protest as a moral issue. Second, the rate of perceived moral convergence. So not just that how important this issue or how morally relevant this particular issue is to me, but how much I believe my group also moralizes this issue. I don't have time to get into too much of the hypothesis, but all I'm going to say is that there's a lot of work by Linda Skitka, Paul Rosen, and others where they argue that once an issue is moralized, it becomes a matter of right or wrong instead of a mere personal preference, and it fosters a feeling that something ought to be done about it one way or the other, potentially contributing to the endorsement of violence. What we were saying is that moralization in isolation is not sufficient. It's contingent on the belief that others share one's moral attitudes. Okay, so in the first study, we looked at online moralization and protest violence. We got tweets about the Baltimore protest that were coded for moral content using the methods that I talked about before, the method that we worked with Hang Ji on. And to evaluate the association between online moralization and violent protests, we relied on two indicators: day-level protest violence, as was determined by a reference to media coverage, and hourly arrest rates, which were calculated from Baltimore Police Department's public arrest data. So overall, what we see is that after accounting for autocorrelation, partial autocorrelation, we see a positive association between occurrence of violent protests and the daily count of moral tweets, where counts of moral tweets on days with violent protests is almost twice as much as days with no protests. But this begs the question, it's a day, does the violence happen first, then moral tweets, or vice versa? And we can't answer that using this data. So, and another thing that I think is important to say is that we didn't see this association for peaceful protests. This is just for violent protests. So therefore, to answer this more important problem, we look at hourly levels of arrest. Results are consistent with hypothesis of Granger causality, where the standardized log count of moral tweets, Granger causes the counts of arrests. So log count of moral tweets at time t, Granger caused count of arrests at t+1. And doing a Bayesian analysis, we see a similar finding where the counts of arrests increases by 1.27 units for every 1 unit increase in moral tweets variable. And this is after accounting for arrest counts in last year during the same day, same time, after accounting for arrest counts during previous hours, variable baseline arrest counts across days, etc., etc. We still get this robust finding that there is a link between moralization on social media and occurrence of arrests later on in the day. Now, that's an observational finding. We can't, of course, make any causal claims from it. Therefore, we did experimental work to try to tie these two together. So in the experimental work, and I'm just summarizing it, we tested the degree to which the moralization of protests predict the acceptability of violence. We had 3 sets of participants that were giving short description of Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we measured to what extent they thought that the counter-protest was a moral issue and whether there should be, whether they would endorse violence against the counter-protesters. In studies 3 and 4, we further experimentally manipulated moral convergence. So we told people that either the majority or few people in the United States share your particular moral values. Other people in the United States think about this protest in similar or different manner compared to you. And this is what we see. So overall, this moralization scale, so the degree that people are moralizing the counter protests, was associated with acceptability of using violence at protests, even after controlling for political orientation. But we also see this nice interaction between moralization and moral convergence, where it is only in the high moral convergence case that moralization seems to be important. So if you believe that others in your social network are also moralizing the issue and you yourself moralize the issue, then that's when acceptability of violence goes really high. Okay, I'm going to talk about a different domain. I think I only have about 10 to 15 minutes. A lot of our work these days focuses on hate. I will talk about some of them, but in this work in particular, we talk about why people engage in acts of hate. There's a lot of work in the social sciences, not that much in psychology, but a lot in sociology and political science. And if I want to summarize this work, this basically, this line of work tells us that acts of hate can be at least partly understood as responses to perceived outgroup threats. But what we're here interested in is what is it about some threats and the people who perceive them that is sufficient for inducing such costly behavior. We use the same moralized threat model that we developed in the previous project, where moralization of a perceived threat, behavior, or conflict is associated with increased risk of violence. And often violence itself is morally motivated. We do 6 studies here. I'm going to briefly talk about 5 of them. The first study was done on Gap. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Gap. It's basically a trash site, social media for the alt-right. So what we did was that we got around 7,000 posts from Gap, and we developed a topology and coding manual for hate speech. We already had a coding guide for moral values. So we annotated these posts for moral foundations and for hate speech. So presence of hate speech and whether it included an individualizing moral frame or a binding moral frame or neither. So the hypothesis was that there is an association between threat-relevant moral values and acts of hate. We trained 2 neural networks, one just to detect hate and a multi-label one for detecting moral concerns. Once the 2 networks were trained, we applied it to the entire Gap corpus, which is around 25 million posts from 236,000 users. We used a multi-level logistic regression where we included, we were predicting hate labels based on whether the text included individualizing or binding moral frames. And what we see here is that posts labeled as evoking binding, that is group level moral rhetoric, had approximately 25 times the risk of containing hate speech compared to posts that did not evoke binding foundations. We see a significant effect of individualizing variables, individualizing values as well, but it is far smaller than the binding values. So study one tells us that hate speech appears to be articulated through the language of group-oriented morality. Then we go to the real world from GAP, and we look at hate groups. So what we're interested in is sort of county level hate group prevalence in addition to county level moral values. So for estimating county level hate group prevalence, we use data from Southern Poverty Law Center. For estimating county level moral values, we used around 110,000 geotagged responses to the Moral Foundations questionnaire obtained from yourmorals.org. Of course, you can't just use these geotags. You have to look at how representative the data is. The data from Your Morals is not representative. So we use techniques from political science, namely multi-level regression with synthetic post-stratification, to try to make these non-representative data more representative to the geography and to the population of the county that they come from. I don't have time to talk about the details, but you can go to mapyourmorals.usc.edu and you see the results of this. This was a big project for us. You can get county level estimates of moral concerns, and you can vary demographics. So if you're interested in, let's just say, young female African Americans who attend church once a week, you want to see what their loyalty concerns are for a particular county, you can use our tool to assess that. So again, what we were interested in was to see whether there's an association between these binding moral values and presence of hate groups at the county level. So we modeled the average count of hate group across 5 years using the Bayesian negative binomial model. And we used spatial autocorrelations as well. So the map that you see here on the left, these are the observed hate group counts. And the map that you see on the right are the predicted hate group counts, just based on moral concerns. So this is what our model predicted, and this is essentially ground truth. Overall, the model does really well. We are, yes, overestimating for some counties in the Northeast. But generally, we're doing really, really well in simply predicting how many hate groups predict in a particular county based on our estimates of moral concerns in those particular counties. So this is the specific results. What we see is that, and we are controlling for individualizing foundations, college, so proportion with 4-year college degree, white population, and proportion below poverty. And while controlling for these other factors, we see for a given US county, a 1-unit increase in binding values is associated with an expected 26% increase in the per capita rate of hate groups. Okay. So what study 2 tells us is that the spatial distribution of hate groups in the US is strongly associated with regional variations in group-oriented moral values.
Also, can I do a question, Morteza?
Absolutely.
The previous graph also showed like an increase of hate groups with the proportion of 4-year college degrees. That seems a bit surprising. Is that?
It is. We were surprised as well, and thank you for noticing that. Over the past year, I've talked to many people about this, and frankly, some people are not in those particular counties, there usually is much more difference between the level of income of the college educated part of the population and the rest. So this potentially could be one way that this is explained, but again, we don't have a solid answer for it.
So you think it's more correlated with income than with education, or is that?
We don't have income as we can't, we're not controlling for income. We're not saying that it's correlated with income. What we're saying is that it might be correlated with sort of the division in that county.
Inequality,
So,
in other words, right? Inequality.
Inequality,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it's not the people with the four-year college degrees that are the.
No,
Okay.
no,
Mhm.
no.
So it would almost seem like
Hmm.
it would almost seem like a Gini coefficient or something like that could be a feature.
Yeah, no, the inequality. I think Christina said. I understand.
Yeah, Gini quality. Yeah, I mean, if we have those Gini factors per county, then
We
could.
have those actually. We have those factors per county. Actually, we'll be happy to collaborate with you to answer this question.
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luz. So what we see in study 2 is that the spatial distribution of hate groups in the US is strongly associated with regional variation in group-oriented moral values. Then the question becomes why? So then we go to our surveys. Hypothesis is that when out-group behavior is seen as immoral, then the risk of acts of hate increases. So we experimentally manipulate threats. I'm just going to give you guys a minute to read this. Okay, I think you get a gist of it. So what we asked, we measured perceived moral wrongness using a 6-point scale. Then we asked justifications of hate, whether it's okay to post hate speech on Facebook, whether it's okay to pass flyers that include hate speech about this outgroup, whether it's okay to use verbal assault against them or physical assault. And again, our hypothesis is that when outgroup behavior is seen as immoral, justification of acts of hate increases. The first population was MTurk, and this is what we got. So participants in the high threat condition scored higher on perceived moral wrongness compared to participants in the low condition. And then we see that on average, participants in high threat condition had higher odds of seeing hate as more justified versus less justified. I'm just going to jump into the conclusion of this work and wrap up the talk so we can have some time for questions. Study 3 tells us that acts of hate are seen as more justified when an outgroup is perceived to have done something morally wrong. I'm going to skip over this and just go to the overview slide. So in study 1, we saw that when people enact hate through language, they do so via the language that evokes the binding values. In study 2, we saw that when people participate in hate groups, they do so in counties that prioritize the binding values. On average, people who see acts of hate as more justified tend to prioritize the binding values. And this association appears to be mediated by the belief that the outgroup has done something morally wrong. Okay, I'm not going to have time to talk about this. All I'm going to say is that these days we're developing NLP techniques to look at hate crimes because the data for hate crimes that we have in this country are very, very bad. The FBI data simply sucks. They're biased. And there are problems with other data sets as well. So we're like, why can't we just look at local news articles and try to extract instances of hate from local news articles? We're building better hate speech classifiers that are less biased. We're looking at bias from our annotators. So how the implicit and explicit bias of our human annotators are affecting the coding of hate speech. We've also released this annotated corpus, 27,000 posts, 3 annotators per post. So overall, we have around 92,000 annotated posts. For hate, we also have the moral labels of them, which we're not yet releasing. My concluding slide, I would say I see myself overall as a computational social scientist. And what I've been doing in the past 3 years is to use computational social science to more deeply engage with the complexity of real world phenomena. And to me, this included balancing 2 different factors. One, do the effects that we observed in controlled settings, in lab-based studies, in experiments, generalize to the real world? This is something that psychologists often fail to do. Do the effects that we observe in the real world replicate in control settings? This is something that the computer scientists often fail to do. And to me, accomplishing this basically involved managing theory-driven bottom-up analyses with real-world inspired top-down analyses and diversification of data. So rather than just using text, rather than just using experimental findings, we incorporate geospatial analysis. We incorporate different sources of data in order to get to these complex, in order to be able to analyze these complex constructs that we all need to work towards understanding and hopefully eliminating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. So first off, there was a question that came up earlier. One is Shabanshu was asking if you'll be able to share these slides afterwards.
Sure. I mean, the video is getting shared, right? So
For sure.
The slides are with it. Yeah, I can share the slides. No problem.
And another question that Avijit had asked a few minutes ago, which was, could you describe how in the first section, BERT and GLOVE representations were aggregated since they're word level embeddings, and how many participants' Facebook posts were used?
Around 2,700 participants, I believe. We had around 110,000 posts. How were they aggregated? My understanding is that they were fine-tuned and we used a simple LSTM to aggregate them together. I'd be happy to share the paper as well.
Great, thank you. Because actually that kind of relates to some of the work I've been doing, where I've been, for various reasons, trying to embed stories into a vector representation. And what we had used as a very simple method was simply do BERT sentence embedding and then aggregate those sentences. But that, of course, ignores the sort of ordering of the sentences. So yeah, I would be personally very interested in what you find as well.
Okay. Christina?
Yeah, I had a question actually. Really fascinating talk. Thank you. I mean, I see many points of connections, context with what you're doing, and I could ask many questions, but I would just limit to one kind of burning questions. You know, what would like to get your thoughts on the impact of kind of maybe like, you know, broadcast media used to serve as a normalizing influence. You know, how much does the framing of the news stories that people hear in the media, how much does it affect their own? You presented some information on this, and I wonder if social media is actually acting as a, you know, bad influence in society by allowing people to form these echo chambers when they're exposed to much more moralizing type views and much more strident views, which allows them to accept, you know, the violence and division. You get the gist of my question, right? You know,
I do. I mean, I don't have that data. There, you know, there are lots of papers about this. I would say my response would be, so we have this work where we show that the more homogeneous in terms of moral values a community is, the more likely it is to endorse violence against the outgroup. We show this on Gab, we show this on Incel, and then we show this experimentally across representative samples. That doesn't directly answer your question, but it's a consequence of it. So when people go into these clusters, that they perceive that others share their moral values, or they associate the same set of moral values to a particular set of issues, the group is more likely to become more extreme over time because of this view of, that whatever I say is shared with my group, and my group seems to be the world, right? And therefore, in those groups, you see a lot of conspiracy theories pop up and get accepted by the group more easily, just because they see such a uniformity in what they, in their beliefs. So what one believes becomes what the group believes.
Right. And this might, this Gab and Incel might attract already people who have these extreme views or something, but I wonder, I'm sure it's also happening more general, like Facebook, Twitter, the kind of more normal systems as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That sounds great. Yolanda?
Hi, Morteza. That was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it.
Hi, Yolanda. Thank you so much.
I have a question for you. Many years ago, before 9/11, I remember listening to a talk by John Horgan on basically terrorism and the psychological drivers behind it. And he had interviewed many terrorists in jails across the world. And maybe you're familiar with his work, but what really shocked me is that he was talking about the lack of opportunity as the driver, rather than the level of education or the morality or the background or their religion, right? That he saw that across all cultures, the lack of opportunity drove people to rebel in that way. So I wonder if you've thought about this, or if that's a factor that we could quantify in some way.
That's a great question. And it's probably true. What we're seeing here is the consequences of this lack of opportunity, of inequality, and all that. So I very much agree with what you're saying. And it's not just him, others have shown similar phenomena. There's this cute example by Scott Atran, who, when he was interviewing kids in poor neighborhoods in Spain, essentially, where some terrorist bombers were living. No, not Spain, Morocco. I'm sorry, this was Morocco. And before Obama was elected, he asked them who their heroes are. And they would say Ronaldinho, the soccer player, Osama bin Laden, and Rainbow, the Hollywood, one of the Hollywood stars who does killing and all that. And then after Obama was elected, it was still Ronaldinho, but this time it was Obama. And then again, the same Hollywood star. So just this perception that there is something for them in the future and they can rise and they might be able to get more access to opportunities in the future, changed their perception, right? And Osama bin Laden was not their hero anymore. So yes, of course, there are more fundamental issues that I'm glancing over. These are the consequences of inequality. Why should we care so much about our group? Well, maybe the group needs that. And that's why evolutionary, we've developed these sorts of propensities to try to focus more on the group level morality. So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Since it's almost 12, I think we'll have to end it there. But I do thank you again for your talk, Morteza, and I do apologize for the interruption. And with that, I think we can stop the recording.
Okay, thank you so much.